Okay, thanks very much for the invitation. I think this is an incredibly timely topic, and thanks to Pete for making this Brazil to Africa jump, because I think it's critical. I think we can learn some things and hopefully learn them for the environment's sake, what's happened in the Amazon and Cerrado, and what we might be able to apply to Africa. Then there are other things I think that aren't applicable, and I'll talk about those. And most of what I want to talk about is just to highlight, as Africa is intensifying, as Pedro pointed out yesterday, intensifying by more inputs and higher yields. And so how does this move forward? It's just happening in a very small part of farms in Africa. I'm going to use maize as an example of intensification and commercialization, but it holds for many, many crops that are intensifying in Africa. Now, I don't know where this, it should work. Well, okay, yeah. Also, I just want to make an excuse. You're not supposed to do this with talks, but my computer crashed Friday morning along with my presentation. So I'd also like to thank all of my colleagues and friends in the audience in the world that have sent me slides that I knew that they had that went in. There are a few blips along the way, just to let you know. Okay, Pedro said yesterday, Africa is big. It's enormous. Look at the countries that fit inside of Africa, but farms are small, not like in Latin America. Here's a recent publication showing farm size in different areas. And so here's the percent of farms with different areas. Look at Latin America. It goes up to over 1,000. Over here, Africa will make it, it only goes up to 50, okay, on the far end of the chart. So more than 70% of the farms have less than 5 hectares. All right, so that is a challenge to begin with when you talk about soybeans, maize, mechanization, and things like that. So let's just note the big differences we see right away. Africa is also very diverse. As Pedro said yesterday, the soils of the Amazon are fairly similar. The cropping systems are right now, you see maize, soybean as some of the topics there. But I'm glad to hear that there's going to be a talk on tree crops today, because I think you have to go with the farming systems and the ecoregions and what you can intensify. I won't talk about anything but maize, but again, most of the world's chocolate is produced here, and they're intensifying cocoa production now. Production is doubling and tripling with improved agronomy. So tree crops, different kinds of crops. I'm going to talk mostly about maize in East Africa, but again, there's intensification happening, as Pedro said yesterday, with camel milk, with cattle milk, with chickens. So intensification is happening for all different crops. Okay, so what happens with intensification? Various things. Many are not studied, and so I'm glad people here are talking about the environment and what happens. So one thing is people always talk about is you increase your income. And Pete's slides were interesting. In some places, people aren't increasing their income with intensification. But it has to take certain steps to increase and become profitable and sustainable. I think we need more studies like that. What actually leads you to go to that intensification step that becomes profitable? Environment. My colleagues in the audience, Chris Neal and Kate Tully, will talk about leaching of nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, into water sources, greenhouse gas emissions from our colleague Jonathan Hickman, and other things, clearing of native habitats. Intensification often also leads to increased deforestation around the world. As much as we think by intensifying, we take pressure off of the forest. Once you provide a market for those crops, you deforest. And so let's be aware of that from the get-go as we move into these African systems. I'll talk about a few of the livelihood issues. Dietary diversity very often decreases when you intensify. Improved nutrition, it's not a given outcome as you intensify. It's a 50-50, and we're not sure what the real trends are. I see tags up there. Maybe he'll say something later about that. But the story's not been told yet, and we really don't know when nutrition is improved or not. It's very often if that cash crop is not a food crop, but it's something to be aware of. And just other things about gender and education I really won't talk about today. Okay, let's just ask a few questions to put it into context. The first one that I've been working in Africa for like 25, 30 years now, and here's a real question. Can smallholders produce sufficient quality and quantity for food and nutritional security to begin with, and then can they move into markets and commercialization? I think it's a real question. How and where can that happen? What are the factors that can do that? If it is going to intensify, where should that happen? And so we've been doing some work on that. I'll talk about, one, to avoid deforestation, and two, to avoid other loss of ecosystem services and other environmental impacts. Again, this whole thing about, does food and nutritional security suffer with the transition from food to cash crops? And this one I'm not going to deal with, but please let's think about it. Will this intensification result in land aggregation of all these smallholder farmers, marginalizing these smallholder farmers even more? I won't deal with it, but we certainly need to think about that. Okay, this is one of these slides I couldn't deal with on my loaner computer. But anyway, just to put some things into context. Now, this is maize production. These are data from the Millennium Villages project we've had in several countries. And just to show you how farmers are producing maize in the 3 sites, one in Tanzania, central Tanzania, one in southern Malawi, and one in northern Nigeria, mid-northern. Okay. So this is number of months where they didn't have enough food to eat. Okay. This is a percent of their land, again, usually less than 2 hectares in this case, planted to maize. Quite large in Tanzania, Malawi, much smaller in Nigeria. Amount of nitrogen applied. Quite high in Nigeria, surprisingly. All 3 of these had subsidized input, some government and some from the project. Look at the yields. 1.5 to 2 tons, almost 3 in Nigeria. So they're increasing, they're intensifying in Nigeria. Percent of maize for home consumption, 28% in Tanzania, Malawi, less, 19% in Nigeria, which is actually selling much more of their maize. They are entering a market economy. Tanzania and Malawi, they're not yet. And so how do you do that? What gets this whole thing moving? So I'm looking at the economists in the room. But anyway, that's the situation. Some are starting to intensify. I can tell you Nigeria has much better infrastructure and markets. They have just developed those markets much better. And this side is much closer to a bigger market. Okay, so this is the Sagpot corridor of Tanzania. It's the southern part. It's called the breadbasket of Tanzania. What this is a yield gap map. It shows from the potential, taken from EASA maps, potential maize production under rain-fed agriculture with fertilization, and the actual yields from the harvest choice maps, okay? The mean yield gap is between 3 and 4 tons of maize per hectare. So farmers aren't even achieving half of what they could be getting. So there are real opportunities for intensification. Again, where can that happen? And how can we get it to happen? All right, so I'll jump to soils now because that's important where you want to focus your efforts. This is just a map to show that the soils of Africa are actually not bad. If you compare acidity, aluminum toxicity, It's not a huge problem compared to tropical America. The Cerrado that's its biggest limitation, is aluminum toxicity, and so on. The biggest limitation is water stress for much of Africa. Okay, but the soils are good. But, as Pedro mentioned yesterday, they've been depleted of nutrients. So they're not very productive. That's part of it. People are not buying fertilizers, less than 10 kilograms per hectare of NPK in much of Africa still. So this is from an NSF bread grant we have, and we looked at, if you apply NPK fertilizer to many soils, we have 4 countries here, what response do you get? Because there's been talk about non-responsive soils. The people are applying fertilizer to maize in Africa and they're not getting good responses. And I said, so what kind of soils were they on? A very good colleague of mine, he's a soil scientist, he said, Cheryl, we don't know. I said, come on, you're a soil scientist and you don't know where. So we put this project together to try to determine the amount of non-responsiveness, were people just overreacting, but also what were the factors in the soils. This is just some of our preliminary results that have come out. But the point is here, this is the fertilizer response. So it's the amount of maize yield you get over the control if you apply NPK. So 0 to 1 ton. That's not a huge increase if you're going to have to apply fertilizers and other inputs to that system. 60% of the sites in Congo had very, very low response. We call this non-responsive soils. 78% in Nigeria. I mean, that's a huge amount. We were shocked because most people said, oh, it's about 20%. Well, that's what we found in Kenya, where most of the early work was. It's about 16%. And so that's a real challenge. If you want to intensify, you need to include nutrients, but you're not going to get an economic yield out of it. You're going to lose money, not just because of your labor, but also because you're not getting enough money for your product. So it's a challenge you have to look at. And we're finding out what these reasons are, and then you have soil management practices that you can use, but they all require more inputs and more labor. And so we have to be very aware of what intensification means and how we're going to have to do it and how we have to target it. Okay, so how are we going to target, and what do we need to consider? For one, I'd like us to say we want to have increased yields and profitability. 2, have minimal impact on leaching greenhouse gas emissions, we could say other environmental factors, and avoid deforestation. Let's try that from the beginning and say, okay, so we could intensify here with maize. It'll hold for many other crops. So with the Woodsole Research Center, we looked at various criteria to put on maps. We looked at the maize suitability, where maize grows well. We used classes 1, 2, and 3. We looked at where there was a lot of clay in the soil. It holds nutrients, it holds water, it's more productive. And then slope. Whoop, the slope is not there. Slope, less than 8% slope. And then we've looked at forest cover. So quickly, these are the maize suitability categories, and we did these top 3. They're the greenish ones. If you overlay the clay and slope categories, it's that 61% of those maize suitability areas actually have good soil features. So that's encouraging. A lot of those maize suitability areas, we would say you can intensify there. And then we thought, well, then maybe we'll deforest. So yesterday we gave 2 criteria. This happened just sort of yesterday. We tried where is there less than 40% forest cover and then less than 10% forest cover. And it turns out a lot of it is not in forested areas, not even woodlands, okay? And then you get to 10%. Almost half of that area is not going to be deforested if you target it to those particular maize suitability and soil features. And in fact, much of it is already cropland, but getting very low yields. And so we find that encouraging. We could target and do well. And I'd just like to emphasize, let's try to help target, working with partners at all different levels to start policies that will provide sustainable intensification. So these are just other factors to think about. Understanding adoption, what causes people to adopt or not, market access, value cost ratios, and just to look at a couple other trade-offs and synergies as we look forward. And these are just the ones about nutrition security. Usually diet diversity decreases as farmers intensify. And it's been shown that as you increase dietary diversity, this is stunting, okay? Stunting goes down, all right? So you need diet diversity for food security and nutritional security. How do we manage that? It's very often through targeted nutrition food interventions. And so, again, it's got to go with policy and programs. It just doesn't happen with intensification. In fact, it'll go the opposite way. This is some work that an undergraduate at Columbia did with us in the Millennium Village. And this is in Ghana where it's cocoa production. Again, it's a cash crop that's not for food. And if you look here at the bottom, the percent of their farmland devoted to that cash crop, and then you look at the different indicators of food security, you'll find out once you get to over 75%, food security actually starts to drop, just as we've been predicting. And so I think just we need more studies like that. What are the factors that lead to those conditions, and what are the policies and programs that you have to put in place? Just some conclusions, Mike, I'm finishing right here, and precautions as we try to move forward. So intensification and commercialization are happening in small bits. They're going to move quickly, we think, in the next decade. You need to consider the biophysical issues, the context where you should intensify, as well as the social factors, land size, incomes, food and nutritional security. Another one is, again, intensification normally leads to deforestation. Let's not pretend it doesn't. More and more people think, you know, oh, we're going to intensify and save the environment. That is usually not what happens unless you have policies like Brazil put in place. Then the whole thing about cash crops, commercialization, and nutrition security, that you have to have targeted interventions to avoid those problems. And again, there are many specific interventions that we need to think about that will make sure women are included and poor groups, because they're often marginalized as we commercialize and intensify. Thank you.